I'm 13 years old and I live about 30 miles from Kansas City, Kansas. My family's always hunted, but we love to fish more than anything. My dad has fished the, can't pronounce this, Marius des Cangas River all his life. I'm just not even going to try that one. He started taking me with him when I was about 5. Dad and I had been on a roll, slamming monster channel cats all summer. Our goal was to catch big flatheads, since I've never caught one before. I was really determined to do that when we got to the river 2 days ago. It was 7 p.m. and about 30 minutes until dusk when we got there. We checked out a few other places before we settled on my grandfather's favorite spot. It didn't take long to unload the truck and get set up. And then 10 minutes later, we were already getting big bites, so we knew it was going to be a good night. Everything was going great. We were having a lot of fun. Dad brought everything we needed to roast hot dogs on the fire, so I was busy cooking myself a couple while I kept an eye on the poles. I love the feeling of being out there. About the time we caught the first nice channel cat and the fish were starting to make a run, that feeling changed. Everything got eerie all of a sudden. It was still and quiet. Behind us, we started hearing brush popping. No sooner did we zero in on that than something was thrown at us out of the darkness and landed right next to us. And then something else was thrown and landed in the water. Well, I kept hearing something stomping right behind me. I turned the spotlight on it several times, but I never saw anything. I was already feeling pretty unnerved when I looked over at my dad, and I could tell right away that he wasn't feeling right about any of this either. That made it all worse for me. If he didn't feel right, this sure couldn't be my imagination. About that time, I started to get the sensation that I was being watched. It was a really creepy feeling in my gut. More branches were popping. That same stomping sound kept getting worse. And by now, I was almost insanely afraid. I had never experienced anything like this before. The sounds and sensing a presence watching me, things being thrown at us, it was worse than anything I could have imagined. So I tried to stay calm and not say anything. I didn't want my dad to think I was a wuss, even though I knew it wasn't in my mind. Finally, Dad said, "If we aren't getting any bites in the next 30 minutes, I think it's time to leave." I felt a bit of relief, but just then he cussed and pointed to the sky downriver. Instantly, I saw what he was pointing at. It was the most absurd thing I have ever seen. There was a bright red dot flickering like a star, but it was going nuts. The whole sky in that direction seemed red. The thing moved up and down, left and right, and then up again. Eventually, it flew out of sight so quickly that it was like it was moving faster than light. We sat there. Whatever was behind us was still watching us. It was still popping the trees and stomping around. After about 20 minutes, Dad said, "Son, we need to go," and I agreed. It was 2:30 when we started carrying stuff up to the truck. As we were standing there loading our stuff, something big started popping branches in the trees across the road from us. So I shined a spotlight, but again, I didn't see anything. We made 2 more trips down to get our stuff. We moved as fast as we could, but it still felt like forever. And then we got out of there. We were heading down the narrow gravel road that we'd come in on, and we were talking about all the things we had just seen. And then we came up on 3 big logs with brush piled on top of them, blocking our path. They were just laying there like they were meant to be a wall. They weren't there earlier. Dad thought about driving through it, and I'd have been okay with that. But he knew the truck wouldn't make it. He had no choice but to get out and manually move it all aside. My father moved every piece of brush out of the way. I never saw him move so fast in my life. Then he got back in the truck and he floored it. We didn't slow down or speak a word until we got to the highway. And once we were on the main road, I asked him what he thought it was that was messing with us. He said he didn't know, but he admitted to having that same super uneasy feeling that I experienced. I really have no idea what it was either, but I believe it was Bigfoot. It could have been paranormal, but what paranormal beings stack 60-pound logs across the road? We may never know for sure what it was, but when things went from great to terrifying, I was just glad that we trusted our gut instinct and got out of there. I started bow hunting when I was 16. We own and hunt 50 acres of woods in northeastern Indiana. It's one of the largest parcels in the area and has provided us with some nice deer over the years. I'm 47 and I'm now an experienced hunter, but at 16 I was still pretty green. I knew the deer that came into my woods traveled back and forth to the woods 3/4 of a mile to our west. So one day during the summer, I decided to secretly trespass onto the land to look for any signs of what and where they may be. This was not done for the intent to poach, only to learn what might be there and eventually make its way over to my woods. I only had a canteen and a hunting knife with me, but it was a short trip and the scouting didn't take long. As I made my way to leave, I came to a creek that divides the woods in half and began looking for a dry place to cross. And as I did so, I suddenly became aware of what I can only describe as a low moan that grew louder and louder. It grew so loud on one continuous note that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. It went on for what seemed like minutes, although I'm sure it wasn't. And then it abruptly and instantly stopped at the height of its crescendo. I immediately leapt into the creek, crossed, and sprinted with all I had out into the bean field that bordered the woods. And at some point, my field knife found its way into my hand, but I have no memory of drawing it. I told my parents about it. They said it was probably the landowner trying to scare me off and teach me a lesson. Well, the following Monday morning, Dad was taking me and my brother to school when we decided to stop at the local Greasy Spoon for breakfast. My dad got to talking to the local farmers, as was the custom, and inevitably my incident was brought up. I remember it very clearly. One of the farmers looked at me and said, "Well, what do you think it was?" Well, I said, "Probably just the landowner trying to scare me off." "And you think he can scream loud enough to vibrate your chest?" the man said. Well, I shrugged my shoulders and then asked, "Well, what do you think it was?" He half smiled and he said, "Probably the same damn things the farmers see jump out of their fields every year during the harvest." "Well, what do you mean?" I asked. With all the concern of a man discussing the weather, he said, "Oh, they'll be harvesting crops, mostly at night. When they get to the end of the row, those damn hairy wild men will jump out and run to the closest woods or fence row." The conversation quickly turned after that. My dad could tell I was freaked out. And on the way to school, he said, "You know he was just teasing with you, right? There's no hairy men running around the woods screaming at people." Well, I know my dad meant well, but at 16 years old, I was far from convinced. In the last few years, I've introduced my children to bow hunting. They've taken to it like fish to water. My daughter got her first deer when she was only 13. My 10-year-old son quickly joined the ranks when he was only 8. Last deer season, I was up at 3:30 a.m. getting ready to sneak out the back to my stand. I like to be in it at least an hour before sunrise. I walked 1.5 miles in the dark, moving as quietly as possible the whole way so as not to be heard. It's quite a workout to carry my bow and all my gear all the way down there. Well, I got up to my stand. I was all settled in and was about to take my usual nap. I just started to doze off when I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread and panic. I've had only 2 panic attacks in my life. Both times I knew what was causing them and I was able to get them under control. But this was something completely different. I was overcome with a mind-numbing sense of urgency to get out of the tree stand and run as fast as I could. Well, I pulled my knife, then I grabbed my flashlight, but it didn't turn on. My eyes frantically searched in the darkness for any explanation for what I was feeling. And I then realized this sense of panic had a direction. That's the best way I can explain it. I could feel where it was coming from. Again, my mind was flooded with the overwhelming desire to climb down and run as fast as I could. It was at this point, on the faint but very recognizable voice of the Holy Spirit intervened and told me very clearly to stay. I sat there and I tried to calm my mind and focus on what I was being told. Again, that clear, small voice said, "Don't get down, just stay where you are." So I stayed. I immediately sent a text to my wife and I told her what was happening. I asked her to pray for me, and I began praying too. And I prayed non-stop for 30 minutes. And suddenly, it went away. The feeling subsided, and the panic was gone, and I was utterly exhausted. A few minutes later, the sun crested the horizon to my back, and I had a clear view of the woods from my tree stand, 20 feet up, and there was nothing there. During the time I was there, I heard absolutely nothing. No birds, no animals moving about, no crickets, no wind, nothing. My woods are located a half a mile from a main highway. Normally, I would hear the occasional vehicle driving by, but not on that day. I remember looking in that direction and seeing cars and semis, but I couldn't hear them. I could hear the rustle of my clothing when I moved, but that was it. Any good hunter will tell you that we hunt by sound as much as sight. Almost every deer I've ever killed, I heard before I saw it. Not to hear anything that day only served to intensify my panic. I sat and hunted until noon before I finally decided it was time to go in. My wife would later tell me I wore an expression she'd never seen before when I arrived home. She said I looked like a frightened or confused child. That was definitely a blow to the mighty hunter ego that I was going for. She gave me time to change clothes and relax a little bit before she started asking questions. Well, I'm a big fan of Occam's razor, which states entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, or more plainly, the simplest answer is usually the correct one. We ran through all the simplest answers before moving on to the not-so-simple answers, and they left us more confused than when we'd started. On Sunday, I spent the entire day researching. I wanted to see if anyone else had experienced this. At first, it was a rabbit hole with no logical progression, but after a while, some common threads started to weave together, namely the idea of infrasound. Over the next week, I convinced myself I had dozed off and had some kind of nightmare, but I continued to research just the same. I learned that some predators, lions for example, use infrasound to instill confusion and panic into their prey to make them easier to catch. Have you ever watched one of those safari documentaries where a lion hunts a zebra or a gazelle? A lot of times the rest of the herd will take off running when the lion charges, but the one he gets hesitates for some reason. It stays still, looks confused or disoriented. Well, that's infrasound. I can't hear it, but we can feel and experience the effects of it very easily. The U.S. military has been experimenting with it for years. Well, I began finding theories on another creature in North America that is believed to use infrasound. The next weekend, when my daughter and I went out to hunt early, any doubts I had would vanish, and she witnessed it all. By the following Saturday, I had done my best to put it out of my mind altogether. My son was feeling ill, but my daughter and I had gotten up early and stalked back to the same location. She got into her stand, and I got into mine. We were about 15 yards away from each other. 30 minutes into our hunt, it was still dark, but the moon was full, so we could easily see 20 yards in front of us to a small clearing. It was a major deer run where we knew we'd most likely be shooting come first light. Well, as we sat there, we clearly heard something approaching from the south. It's not unusual to have deer meander by in the dark, especially when they're some 20 feet below. I assumed that's what we were hearing until I realized it sounded bipedal. Every year, poachers try to sneak onto our property and kill a deer or a raccoon, and then they leave before sunup. I immediately thought this must be a deer poacher then. With my 500 lumen light in hand, I prepared to let this guy walk into the small clearing in front of us, where I planned to blind him and tell him to leave. It would be easy to spot him in the moonlight. The heavy footsteps crunched through the leaves, slowly moving away to the northwest, but I could see nothing. I was looking exactly at the spot where the sound of the steps was coming from. It was only 12 yards from my stand, but there was nothing there. My daughter would later state the same thing. When the steps were 15 yards directly due west of me, I still couldn't see anything. The moon was full and extremely bright. I could clearly see the outline of my daughter in her stand, but I could not see what was making the sound of the footsteps in the leaves. We later learned that we'd both wanted to text each other at that moment, but we were both afraid that it would give us away. When the sun finally lit up the sky, I looked over at my daughter. She pointed at her phone for permission to text, and I gave her the thumbs up. Her text said, "Can we go? I'm scared." Well, I wrote back, "Let's wait until the sun is completely up and we can see everything." "What was that thing? Did you see it?" She texted back, "I don't know what it was, but it was huge. Can you see if Mom will come get us? I don't want to sit here anymore." I told her to just sit tight and wait until it was really bright. We would be less of an easy target if that thing turned hostile. An hour past sunrise, we climbed down and we hightailed it back home. There is a theory that Sasquatch can cloak. It has been postulated that certain types of translucent hair follicles will bend light when vibrated properly by infrasound. Perhaps this explains why we could hear it, but we couldn't see it. And if Sasquatch is real, and I believe they are a diluted offspring of the Nephilim, the Bible clearly shows that the Nephilim returned after the flood. I think they are a polluted bloodline of these beings. That would explain why some of them have supernatural abilities, great speed, incredible strength, infrasound, the ability to cloak. I believe the Sasquatch Genome Project lends some credence to this. With the Sasquatch Genome Project, it turns out we have dozens of samples of hair and blood DNA that comes back as human female, unknown male. What does the Bible say about the Nephilim? They're the product of when demons laid with the daughters of men. Female DNA, unknown male DNA. Well, I know that sounds crazy, but I have a heavy background in science and research. I have a master's degree and 2 bachelor's degrees and an associate's degree in business. But strangely enough, this makes the most sense scientifically. Oftentimes, we Christians relegate Bible things to the Bible. It never enters our minds that they can and do still exist. Where in the Bible does it say that the Nephilim were completely destroyed for the second time? Well, it doesn't. We are only told that they were killed off once and then returned. I also believe this is why prayer seems to work. Both times when I prayed, the thing left. At any rate, this is my story. The following day, we went back to that location and we found dozens of nuts placed 10 to 12 feet up in a multiple Y branches along our access trail to our stands. Well, I grew up in those woods and I've been playing in them for 40 years and I have never seen that. I took pictures for reference. I realized they proved nothing, but it was an extremely odd event.